My name is Emma Hartley, and the cruelest thing anyone has ever said to me happened 3 hours after we buried my mother. I had been awake for 31 hours by the time we got back to the house. 3 years of caregiving does something to your relationship with sleep. You stop trusting it. You learn to exist in the space between exhaustion and function, where everything feels slightly muffled and the edges of the room stay soft, no matter how hard you blink. I had been living in that space for a long time. That afternoon, standing in my mother's kitchen, surrounded by casserole dishes from neighbors and the low murmur of people who hadn't visited once while she was dying, I was barely present at all. My brother found me by the window. He looked uncomfortable in his suit. He always did. He was the kind of man who bought expensive things and then wore them like an apology. His wife stood behind him, one hand resting lightly on his elbow. She had coordinated her black dress with small pearl earrings and an expression I had come to recognize over the years as strategic sympathy, the kind you deploy when there is something you want. He said her name was mentioned in the will. I said I knew. He said the attorney would be reading everything formally on Thursday. I said I knew that too. Then his wife stepped forward, just slightly, and said it. You know, this doesn't change anything about the situation, right? You can't keep living here. You have no income, no career. You gave up your whole life to play nurse, and now what exactly do you have to show for it? The room didn't go quiet. Nobody else heard. It was just the three of us and the window and the light falling gray, and even across the backyard where my mother had kept a garden she could no longer tend in her final months. Play nurse. I looked at my brother. He looked at the floor. I had moved back 4 days after her diagnosis. I had walked away from a marketing position in Charlotte that had taken me 2 years to build. I had given up my apartment, my routine, my version of a future, all of it folded and set aside the way you fold a flag. Not dramatically, just practically. Because she needed someone, and I was the one who could come. My brother sent money twice in 3 years, cards on holidays. A visit at Christmas that lasted 4 days, during which his wife reorganized the kitchen and offered a lot of opinions about in-home care facilities. I had changed my mother's medication schedule around a job that didn't exist anymore. I had sat with her through the nights when the pain medication stopped working as well as it had. I had read to her. I had argued with insurance companies and driven 40 minutes each way to a specialist and learned more about palliative care than I ever wanted to know. I had held her hand when she was afraid, and I had pretended not to be afraid myself, and I had done all of this without being asked because that is what you do when you love someone more than you love the version of yourself you had planned on becoming. Play nurse. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the counter. I said I was going outside for some air. I walked through the back door and stood in the dead garden until the cold worked its way through my cardigan. Then I sat on the bottom porch step and let myself be still for the first time in days. I did not cry. I was past crying. I was somewhere further along, in the territory where grief becomes almost geological, slow and enormous and incapable of rushing. Thursday came. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner. My brother sat across from me in a chair that was slightly nicer than mine, which I suspected was an accident of room layout and not intention, though with him you could never be certain. His wife had not been invited but had come anyway and positioned herself in the hallway close enough to hear everything. My mother's estate was smaller than people assumed. The house went to my brother, along with the savings account and the car. To me, she left the property at 412 Dunmore Road, the old flower shop. My brother exhaled with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite guilt. A hybrid sound. I knew the shop. Everyone in town did. The way you know a building that has been part of a landscape for so long it becomes background. My mother had inherited it from her own mother, run it for 11 years, then closed it when the highway moved and the foot traffic disappeared. It had been sitting empty for nearly 2 decades, sealed and slowly returning to the earth the way empty things do. He reached across and touched my arm. He said it wasn't ideal, and he knew that. He said maybe she could be bought out, if that was what I wanted. His wife appeared in the doorway and said the property probably wasn't worth much given the condition, but she said it in a gentle voice, the voice of someone being reasonable. I said I appreciated the information. Then I picked up my copy of the will and left. I drove to Dunmore Road that evening. Parked in the cracked lot. Sat in the car for a while looking at it. The building was a low brick structure with a faded painted sign above the door that still read Hartley Flowers in letters that had once been green. The front window was boarded. The awning had partially collapsed on one side, curling away from the fascia like a turned page. Weeds had come up through the lot in persistent diagonal lines. One of the front downspouts had disconnected and rusted dark against the brick. I got out and walked to the door. The key from the attorney's envelope fit, but the lock was stiff. It took 3 tries, and both hands. Inside, the air was cold and dense with the particular quiet of rooms that have been closed too long. Dust lay on everything in an even coat. The display coolers were dark, doors hanging open. The counter was still there, solid wood, stained with decades of water rings and soil from pots. Behind it, the door to the back workroom stood slightly ajar. I walked the whole space slowly, not looking for anything, just occupying it, the way you occupy a room you are trying to understand. The workroom was larger. Industrial sink, shelving along 2 walls, a work table, the remnants of wire and ribbon and foam. My grandmother had built something real here, and my mother had continued it. And then the road changed, and the customers stopped coming, and eventually you close the door and go on living elsewhere and try not to think about what you left behind. I was turning to go when I saw it. The shelving unit along the far wall was different from the others. Not obviously. You would have to look twice, which I did, because something in the geometry was wrong. The unit was freestanding, but the gap between its back panel and the wall was too consistent, too intentional. Most freestanding shelving settles unevenly. This one was flush on all sides. I moved closer, pulled gently at the left edge. It swung outward on a hinge. Not a door, exactly. More like a panel that had been built to look like everything else. Behind it, in the wall itself, there was a recessed space roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, lined with wooden shelves. Dry, sealed from the outside air. My hands went cold. On the shelves sat boxes. Banker's boxes, labeled in my mother's handwriting, neat and slanted the way it always was. Property records, insurance, correspondence, business files going back decades. And at the center, at eye level, a flat wooden box I recognized from childhood. She had kept it on her dresser for years. I thought she had gotten rid of it. Inside, an envelope with my name on it, a small leather journal, a set of documents I did not immediately understand. And underneath those, a folder with a single handwritten tab that read, "Emma read this first." I sat down on the cold concrete floor with my back against the work table and opened the envelope. She had written it 18 months ago, while she could still hold a pen without it shaking. The handwriting was controlled, careful. She must have taken her time. "Emma," she had written, "if you are reading this, then you are standing in the place I always imagined you would eventually find. Not because it was obvious, because you are the one who looks." I stopped and breathed. "I need to tell you something I should have said out loud. But I was afraid of what it would do to your brother, so I kept it here instead." The shop was never a consolation prize. It was the only thing I had left that was worth something real, and I wanted it to go to the only one of my children who would understand why. I read the rest slowly. Then I sat with it for a long time. The documents in the folder were not what I expected. My mother had been quiet about most things, including the particulars of money, but she had apparently not been passive. Over the years, through a small trust established with the help of an attorney she had never mentioned to any of us, she had structured the shop's value carefully. The property itself was paid off, had been for 30 years. There was an environmental assessment from 6 years ago I had never seen, noting the lot had been flagged for potential commercial rezoning. There were correspondence files from a regional development group that had inquired about the property twice in the past decade. The last inquiry was 4 years ago. The number attached to it was not small. There was also the journal. I did not read all of it that night. Some of it was too much for one sitting, the way certain kinds of light are too direct, but I read enough to understand that my mother had been watching her family from a quieter vantage point than anyone realized. She wrote about my brother with love but without illusions. She wrote about his wife with a precision that was more honest than anything she had ever said aloud. She wrote about me in a way that made it difficult to remain on the floor. She had written, "I have watched Emma put everyone else's life before her own for as long as I can remember. I do not want to be the reason she keeps doing that. I want the shop to be the reason she stops. I drove back to the house I was still temporarily staying in and lay on the guest bed in the dark, not sleeping, just thinking. Outside, the town was quiet. Inside, something had shifted. Not loudly, just irreversibly. I did not go to my brother the next morning. I was not ready, and more importantly, I was not prepared. There is a difference. Being ready is emotional. Being prepared is strategic. My mother had been prepared for years. I intended to honor that. I spent 3 days going through everything in the hidden space, organizing, photographing, indexing. I found a local attorney through a referral from the County Bar Association, a woman named Patricia Osei who had an office above a dry cleaner on Main, and who listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother was thorough." I said yes. She had been. Patricia contacted the Regional Development Group on my behalf. The inquiry was still live, it turned out. The land adjacent to Dunmore Road had been approved for a mixed-use corridor the previous spring. The shop sat directly within the affected zone. Its value had not simply held over the decades. It had been quietly, enormously appreciating. While Patricia worked on the formal valuation and the documentation, I started cleaning the shop. Not for show. Because it needed it, and because I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't waiting. I swept. I repaired the front door. I called a local electrician who came and assessed the wiring. I arranged for the broken awning to be removed. I bought coffee from the diner 2 blocks over and drank it standing in the empty front room, looking out through the unboarded window at the parking lot and the road and the ordinary Wednesday morning moving past. Word travels in small towns. It always does. Within a week, 3 people had stopped to ask what I was doing with the place. I said I was figuring it out. One of them, an older woman who had bought flowers from my grandmother for 40 years, stayed and talked for an hour. She cried a little. I let her. My brother arrived on a Saturday without calling. He pulled into the lot and sat in his car for a moment before getting out. He looked around at the cleaned facade and the new door hardware and the absence of the collapsed awning, and something crossed his face that was too complicated to name easily. He had not expected progress. People who assign you the worthless thing rarely do. He came inside. I was behind the counter doing nothing in particular except being present in the space, which had started to feel less foreign. He said it looked better. I thanked him. He said he had heard I had been here a lot. I said that was accurate. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked around with the discomfort of someone who has arrived at a conversation they prepared for differently than it is going. He said he wanted to talk about the buyout option. That his wife had found a property manager who thought a quick sale made more sense than a renovation project. That he was just thinking about what was practical for me, given everything. I said I appreciated it. He said the estimate they had gotten put the value at somewhere around $60,000, which was fair given the condition. He said he would split legal fees. He said it could be a clean situation. I looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent his life choosing the easiest available interpretation of every situation, and that habit had calcified into something that looked, from the outside, like carelessness. I said I had gotten my own assessment. He said, "Oh." I said the number was different. He said, "Different how?" I told him. I watched his face. The number did things to it that his usual composure could not quite contain. He said that couldn't be right. I said Patricia could send him the documentation if he wanted to review it. He was quiet. Then he said, slowly, that he had no idea. That he thought Mom had just held on to the place for sentimental reasons. I said she had held on to it for my reasons. He didn't understand that yet. I let it sit. He left without a resolution. I did not expect one that day. His wife came alone 2 days later. She arrived mid-morning, dressed as though the occasion required effort, which it apparently did. She walked through the front door with the particular kind of smile people use when they are recalibrating in real time and don't want you to notice. She said she was just stopping by. I said the door was open. She looked around with the critical attention of someone pricing things as she went. Then she turned to me and said, very pleasantly, that she hoped I wasn't making any major decisions without consulting the family. I said I consulted my attorney. She dropped the pleasant, just slightly, the way a stage set drops a panel when the mechanism behind it gives. She said that the shop situation was more complicated than I seemed to understand, that there were estate considerations, shared history, family obligations. that it would be a shame if things got contentious over a property that nobody had even been inside in 20 years. I said my mother had been inside it. She had put things there for me to find. Something moved behind her eyes. I said I didn't want things to be contentious either. I said I thought the most straightforward path was for everyone to honor what my mother had actually intended, which was documented and legal and not ambiguous. She said, my mother, at the end, had not always been thinking clearly. I kept my voice level. That took more effort than anything else I did that week. I said my mother had written the trust documentation 18 months before she died, when she was clear and deliberate and entirely herself. I said Patricia had confirmed the timeline. I said I would appreciate it if that particular line of reasoning was not pursued further, because I found it both inaccurate and unkind. She left shortly after. Not warmly. The confrontation I had not planned for came 6 weeks later at my cousin's engagement party, which my brother and his wife hosted at their house, and which I had considered not attending, and then decided I was done making myself smaller for the comfort of people who had never extended the same courtesy to me. It was the kind of party that announces its own expense at every turn. Catered food, rented linens, a bartender, 40 people who mostly knew each other through the same narrow social current. I arrived in a blue dress and quiet shoes, and helped myself to sparkling water and talked to my cousin for a while about her fiancé and her plans, and the things that actually mattered about the evening. I was near the back of the room when my brother's wife found me. She had been drinking, not enough to be obvious, just enough to sand down whatever filter usually stood between her and her real opinions. She came close and said, quietly, that she knew what I was doing with the attorneys and the valuations and the development group. She said it was transparent. She said I was punishing the family for something they hadn't done. I said the property was mine, that pursuing its value wasn't punishment, it was just use. She said my mother would not have wanted division. I said my mother had wanted me to have something that belonged to me, and that was exactly what I intended to have. She raised her voice slightly. Not enough for the whole room, enough for the people nearby. She said I had always been resentful. That caregiving had not been something I was assigned, but something I had chosen because I had nothing else going on. That my brother had responsibilities, a career, a life. That some of us had to build something while others played the martyr. The room had gone partially quiet, the way rooms do when they sense that what is happening at one end of them is worth attending to. I set down my glass. I said I was going to say one thing, and I was going to say it calmly because I had not come here to perform anger in front of my cousin's guests. I said that I had left a career to come home because my mother needed someone present, and her son was not available, and I made that decision without regret and without expectation. I said that my mother had understood what that cost. I said she had left me something in recognition of it, not because she was confused or manipulated, but because she was a woman who saw clearly and planned carefully, and loved her children in proportion to what they had given. I said that was not division, that was honesty. My brother had crossed the room. He was standing just behind his wife now, and he looked the way people look when they realize a story they have been telling themselves for years has just been told differently in public. His wife started to say something else. Her voice caught. I said I was going to go congratulate my cousin, and I hoped they both had a good evening. I did exactly that. My brother called the following Tuesday. His wife was not on the line. He spoke carefully, which was unusual for him. He said he had been thinking. He said he wanted to understand what my mother had actually written, if I was willing to share it. I thought about it. Then I sent him a copy of the letter. Not the journal. Not everything. Just the letter. He called again that evening. He didn't say much. He said he hadn't known she felt that way. I said I thought she hadn't known how to tell him. He said that wasn't an excuse. I said I agreed. We stayed on the line in silence for a moment, which was its own kind of conversation. The development group made a formal offer 2 months later. Patricia negotiated. The number that came back was the kind of number that does not change your life all at once, but changes the shape of every year that follows. I accepted. With a portion of what came through, I did something I had not planned and could not entirely explain. I kept a smaller adjacent parcel, the narrow lot beside the shop that had always technically belonged to the Hartley family property. And on that lot, slowly, I began something new. Not a flower shop, something adjacent to it, a small community workroom. The kind of space where people could come and learn practical things. Basic repair, gardening, food preservation, the skills that had been squeezed out by convenience and time. I hired 2 people to help run it. One of them was a retired woman from my mother's church who had known my grandmother and teared up the first time she walked through the door. I let her do the same thing the older woman had done with me. I just let her talk. My brother came by one afternoon in early spring. He had driven over without calling, which was a small change but a real one. He stood in the doorway of the workroom and looked around at the people and the tables and the light coming through the new windows, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said it was something. I said Mom would have liked it. He said yes. He thought so too. We had not repaired everything between us. That is not how repair works. It is not a single event, but a sustained practice, like anything that requires maintenance. Some mornings I still woke up with the weight of those 3 years on my chest, the accumulation of what had been spent and what had not been acknowledged, and I would lie there for a while and let it be what it was before getting up and moving on. But I had stopped waiting to be seen by people who did not know how to look. My mother had written at the end of her letter, "I do not know what you will build there, but I know you will build something." That has always been the difference. I kept that sentence in my desk drawer. I did not display it or share it or make it into something public. Some things belong to the space between 2 people, even when one of them is gone. That letter was hers and mine and no one else's, and the quiet of that felt right. It felt like the thing she had always been trying to teach me, that the most important things are rarely announced. They are simply done, and then they stand, and eventually the people who doubted them have to walk through the door and see. If you found something in this story that reminded you of a weight you have been carrying, I hope you set it down gently. Not because it doesn't matter, because you do. If stories like this one speak to something real in your life, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more, we will be here.